class, just doing a really high level talk and kind of view of what Angular is and trying to get a little bit of a sense of how it works. So we've been working with our Node Express Mongo, our task manager application. So what we're going to do today, we're going to build a separate application where we're just kind of getting used to Angular and how it works. And then in the next week or two, we're going to want to rebuild the task manager as a single page application where we've got an Angular front end, so we can do create, read, update, and delete on a single page with no page reloads. That everything is just updated dynamically in real time. So what I'm going to do is first going to go find my folder where I've been creating my Angular work, sorry, my Node work so far. So we're going to scaffold the new application, but we're not going to use Express at all for this. In fact, we're not even going to use Node really. We're just going to use Angular, TypeScript, HTML, and CSS for today. So we'll play around with Angular on its own, and then we'll look at integrating it into the rest of the stack in the next week or two. No, we're going to do it. We're going to do it from the command line. There's an Angular scaffolding tool, so we're going to use that to build our project. So all we want to do is basically just go into kind of the root folder where your other projects for your other folders for this course are. But we're not going to manually make a folder. We'll let Angular make the project folder in the same way the Express generator makes a new project folder when we're using Express. So I'm just going to go into this folder, which for me is my user directory, rfreeman node. I'll just copy that path. And then I want to go there in my command prompt. It doesn't really matter where you are on your machine. So you can create this anywhere you like, doesn't really matter, but I may as well. I'm going to use my existing path where I've been doing everything else for the course. I'll put it in the same folder. So I have a node folder. I'll just put it here. Maybe not. So we want to make a couple of global installs first. We want to install the Angular command line interface package. That basically is kind of an Angular version of the Express generator. We also need to install TypeScript because Angular is not going to run if we can't create and transpile TypeScript files. So I'm going to run two npm I commands. First, I'm going to npm I @angular.cli. Don't forget the @ symbol. So CLI command line interface, and it's -G. Slash. Sorry. Yeah. Do as I do, not do as I say. So npm I @angular/CLI -G. So this will install the Angular command line interface as a global package. So we can use this to scaffold out multiple Angular apps. The other thing we want to install globally is TypeScript. So the command is just going to be npm I TypeScript -G. So we will need both of those. There may be one other related package we need, but I don't think we need it anymore. So we'll see if we can run things with these two. So,
I have a question for you, Rich. I've worked with some projects that people use Yarn instead of NPM. What's the difference?
I have used Yarn before. Yarn is, okay. I don't have a good answer, so rather than make one up, I'll Google one. It's been probably it's been at least 3 years since I even touched Yarn, so I don't remember it very well. Okay, this is, and it's old. Let's see. So Yarn is created by Facebook. Actually, sorry, this other link I think is more current. Let's go back. So here, let's see. So this is a 2019. Let's see what this, obviously this is one person's opinion, but let's see. Okay, we know what a package manager is. So Yarn was created by Facebook, arguably be better and more streamlined. So Yarn is simply an alternative command line client. To connect, it doesn't have its own repository. We're still connecting to NPM, to the NPM online repository. Yeah, so it's still, you're still installing from npm.js, like it's still coming from there regardless. So there's been some module hijacking. NPM tracks everything through package.json. Selective version, okay, it has automatic retries on requests that fail. It caches every package, so you don't need to download it again. Yarn is the clear winner in terms of performance, especially for big projects with 100+ packages. Oh, that was originally. So Yarn is still the clear winner. Yeah. Both of them are now viable. Security. Facebook developed Yarn to address securities in a better way. So this person's opinion is Yarn is still preferable. NPM is still more commonly used. So this person says Yarn, I don't see any compelling reason really one or the over the other. Okay, so I'm going to install my @angular/CLI, and then I'm going to install Typescript. This is quite big, as you can see. The progress bar is just kind of chugging along slow, like it's got a ways to go. And then I'll do npm I Typescript, also -G. So @angular/CLI, and the other package is Typescript. It's going to create, it's fine, but when we use the Angular CLI tool, it's going to create a folder with a whole bunch of files in it, the same way Express Generator does, right? It creates the directory first, and then it puts all the files inside. So that's why I'm doing it in my root folder, because I'll use the Angular CLI to generate a folder. Okay. So we can run, using the Angular CLI, we can run Angular commands with the command ng. ng is Angular. So now that I've installed the CLI and I've installed Typescript, I'm going to run ng new. So this is kind of the equivalent of the Express generator when we do Express. And then I'll just name my project. So I'll just call it Fall 19 Lesson 10. So I'm making a new project using basically the Angular scaffold tool. Well, you're going to see NG in a couple places. We use it both at the command line, but we also use it within our view code. So for things like a loop, we have NG4. We have for decisions, we have NG if. So we'll actually see this embedded in our view as well, right in our UI. So NG new, call it whatever you want, just don't put any spaces in the name. So this is Angular's equivalent to the Express generator. It's going to scaffold. It's asked us if we want Angular routing. We'll say no to that for now. If we do Angular routing, we'll maybe build a separate project. So I'll just hit N. And it says, which style sheet format do we want? It defaults to vanilla CSS that's highlighted in blue. So I'm just going to hit enter here. I don't need Sass or less. I'll just hit enter. Unlike the Express generator, it creates a bunch of files and scaffolds an actual working application that we'll be able to load right away. NG space new space, whatever you want to call it. I called it lesson 10. Yeah. We'll deal with that next week. So you can say no. So you can say no to routing, and you can just hit enter for CSS. It'll just accept the default choice of plain CSS. No Sass or less. Yeah, just hit enter for the CSS part. So once this is done, it's chugging along. I'm going to open up WebStorm and open up my new F2019 lesson 10 folder so we can see what this scaffold tool gives us. And then we can start to modify it. Okay, so we get a lot. 1,191 packages were included here. If I check my directory now, here it is. Whoops, wrong. So it's big. It's half a gig. Sorry, it's a quarter of a gigabyte with 31,000 files. That's what we got. Remember, we said Angular is a framework. It's opinionated, but it's big, but it allows us to do things quickly and easily if we can follow the conventions of how Angular wants us to structure our app. So I'm going to open up this folder in WebStorm. So I'll open up my project. We can have a look at what's here. So we do get a package.json file that we're used to. You can see it brings a whole bunch of Angular dependencies in. The core, the compiler, animations for dynamic front end, Angular forms, routing, a bunch of dev dependencies. So things like Jasmine and Karma. So I think Giffen mentioned earlier that Angular is easy to test. So Jasmine and Karma are unit testing frameworks that we can use. So we've got a Karma configuration right here for testing if we want. And then our actual application lives inside this SRC folder. So that we get a few things here by default. We get an index.html that looks pretty much like a standard HTML page except for one thing. If you look at my code editor, what's the one thing that is unusual or new here? Yeah, that line 11 tag is the app root. So the app root is referring to an Angular component. So we basically have a header and body. There's nothing else in here. So all the source actually lives inside of our component. So we can create our own HTML tags that reference the different components of our application. So we may have something like a login component, a task component. Gives us a favicon, which we can overwrite. It gives us a main TypeScript file. So this is what your TypeScript file might look like. We're importing a few Angular modules. We don't generally touch this main.ts file. There's also a test file here, as well as a default style sheet. So if we have global styles, they've already given us a styles.css template that we can populate. Yep, we could. Well, so let's see what else is here. So under app, we've actually got another HTML file. So here's our home page, and again, our home page, it contains this app root tag. So let's look at how this works. Under app, we've got 5 files that all start with the word app. So the main one, this app root, this is referring to our TypeScript component. So this is where most of our actual code goes. So it requires the Angular core, and it creates an Angular component with 3 properties. This selector, how is this related to the index file we were just looking at? So if you look at line 4 here, we've got this selector app root. And we see this app root tag rendered in the index here. So what do you suppose this selector attribute does? Yeah, it basically lets us create this component inside our HTML page with this kind of custom tag. And then we've also got basically a partial. So this component, any HTML, gets rendered in here. It also specifies a page-specific style sheet. So we can write CSS that's specific just to this component if we want. We don't have to. We could use global styles instead, but it's set up to allow us to write individual styles for individual components. And then we export this as a public object, and we give it a title. So here's what the HTML page looks like. It's long, if you see from the progress bar. We've got a massive amount of styles, which probably we're going to want to take out of here. You've got like 200 lines of CSS in here, almost 300. But we have a style sheet, we can remove it. And then we have some template code. And here's where we see our handlebars tags. So our component has a title property on line 9. And in the HTML view, way down on line 3344, we're outputting that title from the component. So if we change it in the component, it'll update in the view. So let's just run this and see what we get. There's a whole lot of stuff here. We want to kind of simplify it. The template, there's lots here. We're going to actually strip it down so it's a little easier to work with. But we can launch it, so I can either use my terminal now that I have WebStorm open, I can use my terminal, or I can use it here. So we're not going to use the nodemon command. We're actually using an Angular command, so we can actually just run the command npm start. Or WebStorm has a button here, sure. Run my server within WebStorm, sure, we could do that too. So the port, the default port, or you could run the command ngserve. That also starts the server. So it's got to compile. You're also going to notice here in my output window, it's using this tool called Webpack. Has anybody heard of Webpack or know what Webpack does? So Webpack is designed, it partly does what nodemon does for Angular. So it watches the Angular server for changes. So if we change things, it will do an auto restart. But it also allows us to automatically load things like Bootstrap and jQuery if we want them. So it tells us our Angular development server is on localhost 4200. That's the default port. So let's hit that port, see what we get. So we've got a bunch of stuff here. It has the title of our application. It's got a whole bunch of content here. Pardon? It does, yeah, because the terminal window looks like a Mac terminal. So here's our title, right? So it says, I called mine F2019 lesson 10. So that is in my source app in appcomponent.html. It's down on line 344. So here's our title. So let's see what happens. Here's kind of the neat thing. I'm going to try to bring up my app. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, so here's my title. So if I'm going to go to my app component, let's say I want to change this title. And, let me just kind of shrink this. So I would recommend, if you can, see both your browser as well as your code editor at once. So on line 9 in my app component.ts, this F2019 lesson 10, that gets rendered right here. So if I change this title here, I'm going to change that title value and hit save in my code editor. My page is automatically reloaded. Here's our title. appcomponent.ts, where it's creating the component and exporting it and setting up the title. So our component has a property called title. I'm going to go back to my app component.html. Let's say I'm going to go back to line 344. What happens if I change this tag? It's written properly with a lowercase t. If I change that to an uppercase and save my file, just not there because it doesn't recognize that property. Graceful failure. Okay. Now, we got a whole lot of stuff here we don't really need. We don't need all of this stuff. I hope if I spelled Angular correctly. I'm not sure. So let's clean some of this stuff up. Maybe what we'll do is let's take everything after this line 350, all this other HTML, let's just remove it. We don't need it. Just kind of cluttering up the page. So I'm going to remove all the buttons and icons. From line 350, there may be an opening div somewhere. I think I'll leave the one closing div on line 526. So that's the bottom of my file. So I'm going to start on line 350, delete everything up to and including 524. That's just all boilerplate content we don't need. So 350 to 524. Oh, that's a good question. I should probably look. There's a closing div. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm leaving 350. So from 352. Sorry. So I'm going to delete all that stuff. So I'll just save and I don't even have to do a reload. Right, so it just reloads, updates automatically, which is cool. We don't even need to refresh it. Now, the other thing is we have like 250 lines of CSS, but they've put this directly in the HTML when, first of all, we have a CSS file here, and second, we have a global CSS file right in our root. So if we want these styles to be global, it would make sense to move all that code out of our HTML file. Let's put in our global CSS. So I'm going to go back to my app.component.html, and from line 11 down to, I don't need the opening and closing style tags. We'll remove those, but right to 295. So from line 11 to 295, let's cut those. So let's cut those. We can delete those style tags. And then I'm going to paste all of that CSS in. I have to go outside of the app folder. It's right in the root of source. We have styles.css here. So I'm going to paste all that stuff in there and save. That's actually, I'm going to try one thing. And I'm going I'm going to take it out of here just out of curiosity. I'm going to put it in this app component.css for a minute because it looked like we lost the font. Just see if I put it in here. The font definitely changed when I moved it. Yeah, it would have been a different font. Yeah, let's put it in app.component.css instead. Now, here's one of the other interesting things. If I view the page source, here's all we get. We see the app root tag that calls our app component, but all of the Angular code is actually hidden from the user. All they see are the various JavaScript links and our tag. So any of our logic, anything that's happening in the component, no longer gets sent to the browser. It all is dynamically generated at runtime through JavaScript. Thanks to Ken's and Brady's favorite language. Right. So also more difficult. So there's a few benefits of this. Users don't see all the HTML output in the browser. This should also run faster because there's less HTML being sent. Right? It still gets sent, but JavaScript is in effect injecting it inside of this component. The browser doesn't have to parse all that HTML. JavaScript, Angular's doing that already. Which I think is sort of neat. We can also change the heading up here. So in my browser tab, it still says F2019 lesson 10. If I want to change that, that's not in my app component. That's actually within my index.html. Right? So here's my title here. It took the name of my project. So I want to call it lesson 10. Intro to Angular. So if we wanted something like a global navbar, we could just put it in index.html because the idea is this is the only full page. This is the container for our whole application. All of the subpages are basically partials that will get injected based on a component. So we can swap different components in and out of the HTML body. So the HTML body stays in the browser, it loads once, and just the components are switched.
Is it kind of like a multi-page application that has a single page wrapper?
Yes. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. So as opposed to, though, if you think about, compare it to like a Visual Studio project, we have a layout, and the layout is still injecting the individual views in the middle, like below the header and above the footer. But still, each request, it still actually loads an individual view, and that view then pulls in the wrapper. So each request, it's loading over and over again. In this case, we load the wrapper in the browser, and we just swap out the body using Angular components. And every Angular component has an HTML front end that gets injected in the middle. Nope. No, you don't. You should be able to run this basically on any, because it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There isn't a back-end piece that you need for this, which is great. Right, so as soon as I don't even have to refresh my page, I updated my title on index.html. I saved it. I go back to my browser. It's already reloaded. Yeah. So for today, it gives us one component. It gives us this default component called app component, and each component comes with, you know, this whole set of files. The HTML for what gets rendered to the browser, CSS, our Typescript file, which is where we actually write our logic and code, and then our Typescript file gets transpiled into, it'll get transpiled into JavaScript, but we don't actually have to do that. We just work in Typescript. The transpilation happens kind of behind the scenes. Well, it wasn't, because you need to know how to manipulate this. So we're going to work, for today, we're just going to work in the app component because that's the main component. We'll do all our logic in here. Somebody mentioned earlier that Angular really, it supports MVC, and it does. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in a more full, so this is, I'll go back to that Ionic app that students built that's using Angular. So if we look in the source code, we've got a components folder. So here's our index. So if we look for the components, so when it first loads, it loads this root Ionic tag. So this is like our app root. Yep, this is the GitHub repo, the mobile app. So within the main component, if we want to go and look at, say, like a contract component, we get the Typescript file where all the logic for our contract is. We've got a constructor, and here we've got our selector. So that's our component tag that we would inject if we want to show a contract. It's got an HTML template for, let's say, an opportunity. Same thing. We've got a TypeScript component with a constructor with methods. So depending on whether this contract was approved, rejected, or waiting, it gives it a different, it has a color attribute. And again, it's got both an HTML. So here's what the front end might look like. You know, we've got some Ionic tags, and Noah, here was that NG. So here's NG4. Yeah, so there's our, yes. Yeah, it's different. The syntax is different. So in a full-blown application, basically every class, it has its own component, and each component gets its own HTML partial. And as our app runs, we just show or hide different components all within that one index.html, which never has to reload. We're just swapping out the components that are displayed inside of it. So the index is just a container. So for today, we're just going to work within this app component. When we integrate this into our full mean stack, we'll build a task component. And all the logic to handle the tasks will go in there. All the front-end logic. And then it's got to have a back-end service to call. So we're going to have to break apart our Express controller, because our Express controller not only does all the back-end create, read, update, delete, but it also loads specific views. So we're going to break it. Our controller, rather than loading views, it's just going to return JSON to Angular. Send and receive JSON, and Angular handles all the front-end stuff. Yeah, so our Express controller basically becomes a JSON REST API. And then we have an Angular front-end that interacts with it. So that's where we're going. Okay, it's 5 to 10. We'll pause here, we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to start making some changes to this component. We'll mock up some data in our component. We'll see how we can render data through our component, and then we'll look at how the two-way data binding works, where we can make changes and things will update in real time in our UI. Okay. I'm not going to bother pushing this to Git because all I really did was scaffold it and change one or two things. I'll push it up to Git later when we're finished.